Elizabeth Carter had exactly 3 coins left in her pocket and 1 letter that said she had a job waiting if she could get there before sundown. She stepped off that wagon into the Kentucky heat with nothing but her backbone and her word. Walked straight past a man mending a fence post like he was born to do it, and asked him where she might find the person in charge. He looked up slow, wiped the sweat from his jaw, and said, "You're looking at him, ma'am." She didn't believe him. She should have. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, follow along to the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Elizabeth Carter to the Hayes property did not slow down gradually, the way a considerate driver might ease a passenger into an arrival. It stopped hard, the horses throwing their heads back, and the driver, a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier, turned around on his bench and looked at her with something close to pity. "This is as far as I go, Miss Carter." Elizabeth looked past him at the long fence line running toward a property she could not yet fully see. The road ahead curved into shade. She could hear the distant sound of something hammering one steady, patient beat, over and over. "The posting said there would be someone to meet me." The driver shrugged. "The posting said a lot of things. I'm only paid to deliver you to the property line." He climbed down, lifted her trunk from the back with more effort than ceremony, and set it in the dust beside the wheel. Then he looked at her the way men sometimes looked at women traveling alone in 1818, like they were either brave or foolish. And time alone would tell which. "Word of advice," he said, taking up his reins again. "Don't go making enemies on that property before you understand who's who." She opened her mouth to ask what he meant by that, but the wagon was already moving. Elizabeth Carter stood alone on a dirt road in Harlan County, Kentucky, with the midsummer sun pressing down on the top of her bonnet, a trunk that needed carrying, and the last 3 coins she had in the world tucked into the lining of her right glove. She was 26 years old. She had been a housekeeper before this. A good one, organized, decisive, respected in the household, where she had worked for 4 years. Right up until the day she had opened her mouth to defend a laundry girl who was being blamed for a theft she had not committed, and in doing so had made herself unemployable in every fine home in Lexington. That was 6 weeks ago. This position, housekeeper at the Hayes property, one of the largest privately held estates in Harlan County, was the only response she had received to the 15 letters she had written. She picked up the smaller of her 2 bags, grabbed one handle of her trunk, and started dragging it toward the gate. She was halfway up the road when she heard the hammering stop. A man stepped out from behind a section of fence post that had partially collapsed against a stand of old oak. He was holding a mallet in one hand and a length of wire in the other. And he was watching her, the way working men sometimes watch the arrival of someone who clearly needed help but had not yet asked for it. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of forearms that came from years of physical work. His shirt was rolled to the elbow and darkened with sweat. His face was angular, weathered by sun, and he wore no hat, his dark hair slightly damp at the temples. He did not come toward her immediately. He just watched. Elizabeth stopped walking. She straightened her back, a habit she'd had since girlhood. Her mother's voice in her ear. "A woman who stands tall is taken seriously," and looked directly at him. "I am Elizabeth Carter," she said. "I've been engaged as the new housekeeper. Is there someone who can assist with this trunk?" The man set his mallet down against a fence post. He walked toward her with an unhurried gait, the kind of walk that did not apologize for its own pace. And he took the handle of her trunk without comment. "Thank you," she said, falling into step beside him. "And you are?" "Nathaniel," he said. "Nathaniel." She repeated it the way she always repeated a name when she was filing it away. "Are you one of the farm hands?" He was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like a man who was deciding how much of an answer to give. "I take care of this land," he said. That seemed clear enough. She did not press further. There was a great deal to be done. And she had learned early in her career that the best housekeepers were the ones who wasted no time. "How many are in the household staff?" she asked. "Currently?" "3." She stopped walking. "3. A stable boy. And until about 10 days ago, a housekeeper." He glanced at her sideways. She left. "Why?" Another pause. "That's a question with a longer answer than this walk deserves." Elizabeth looked at the property spreading out before her, the main house substantial and old, the outbuildings in various states of repair, the fields beyond stretching toward a ridge line. This was not a small operation. 3 staff for a property this size was not just understaffed. It was neglect. "Who manages the household accounts?" she asked. "Closest thing to an answer is a man named Gerald Pruitt," Nathaniel said. "He handles the books out of an office in Harlan Town. Sends instructions by messenger. And the owner?" Nathaniel set her trunk down on the porch steps and looked at her with those steady, unreadable eyes. "The owner keeps to himself," he said. The cook's name was Martha Boone, and she had the manner of a woman who had been holding an entire household together, with very little support for a very long time. She was in her mid-50s, compact and sharp-eyed. And when Elizabeth introduced herself, Martha looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone who had been let down by too many promised solutions. "You're younger than I expected," Martha said. "I'm competent," Elizabeth replied. "I find that matters more." Martha's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something in the vicinity of one. "Well, come have some coffee, and I'll tell you everything they didn't put in the letter." What they hadn't put in the letter was considerable. The previous housekeeper, a Mrs. Alderton from Lexington, had arrived full of confidence and left after 3 weeks, telling anyone who would listen that the Hayes estate was impossible to manage because the owner was never present to make decisions, and the man from the accounting office, Gerald Pruitt, changed the instructions every other week. The stable boy, a 14-year-old named Caleb, had been doing the work of 3 men and sleeping in the barn because no one had made arrangements for him inside the house. Half the linens were rotting in storage. The household accounts, when Elizabeth asked to see them, could not be produced because Pruitt kept them in town and only released summaries on the 1st of the month. "And the farmhand Nathaniel," Elizabeth said carefully. "How long has he been here?" Martha wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Longer than anyone else." "Does he answer to Mr. Pruitt?" "He answers to himself, mostly." Martha looked at the window. "Nathaniel knows this land better than anyone. He's the one who's kept it from falling apart entirely. You want something fixed, something managed, something that actually works. Nathaniel's your man." Elizabeth filed that away. She spent the rest of that first day doing what she always did when she arrived in a new household. She walked every room, opened every door, looked inside every cabinet. She made lists. She identified problems. She prioritized. It was the kind of work she was genuinely good at. The kind that asked for nothing except clear eyes and a will to see things as they were, rather than as someone wished them to be. By evening, she had 3 pages of notes and a working plan. She also had a headache from the heat, aching feet from the walking, and a deep, considered annoyance at whoever had allowed this property to fall into this state. She found Nathaniel at the end of the day, sitting on an upturned crate near the stable, eating a piece of cornbread and watching the last of the light leave the sky. "The roof of the east wing has a section that's pulling away from the ridge beam," she said, without preamble. "It needs to be looked at before the next hard rain, or we'll have water damage in 2 of the upper rooms." He looked at her. "I know. And the fence along the lower pasture has 3 sections down. If the horses get through." "I know that too." She stopped, looked at him. "Then why hasn't it been fixed?" He held her gaze for a moment with those even, unhurried eyes. "Because I've been doing the work of about 6 men with the resources of about 1. She could not argue with that. She had seen the evidence of it all afternoon. "What does Mr. Pruitt allocate for repairs?" "Not enough. I'll write to him in the morning." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, not amusement exactly, but something close to it. A private, quiet thing that she couldn't quite read. "You're welcome to try," he said. "I don't try things," Elizabeth replied. "I do them." She turned and walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard nothing, no comment, no response. When she glanced back once, he was watching her go. That same unreadable expression on his face. The letter to Gerald Pruitt went out the next morning. The response came back 4 days later, written in a cramped, impatient hand, informing Miss Carter that she was welcome to manage the household to the best of her ability within the current budget allocations, which were fixed, and that any requests for additional funds would need to be submitted in triplicate to the office, considered on the 1st of the following month, and approved by the owner, who was, the letter concluded, unavailable for correspondence at this time. Elizabeth read it twice, then she folded it very precisely, set it on the corner of her desk, and went outside to find Nathaniel. He was at the water pump, filling a trough, his back to her. He heard her coming and didn't turn immediately, just kept working with that same steady patience she had come to recognize in him over 4 days. "We're going to fix the east roof," she said. He straightened and turned to look at her. "Pruitt approved the funds?" "No." "Then how?" "There's timber in the east barn that's been sitting unused for 2 years. There's pitch in the supply shed, and I've been told you know how to do the work." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to do it. I'll account for the materials in my monthly report as deferred maintenance already in inventory." Pruitt can argue with the record-keeping if he chooses. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Then you've done this before." She paused. "In my last position, the household steward refused to authorize an emergency repair on a chimney in November. I used existing materials and household labor and kept the family from a fire that winter. Then I documented it accurately and let the math speak for itself." He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her, not the brief, evaluating glance of a man deciding whether a woman was worth listening to, but the considered attention of someone genuinely recalibrating their first impression. "All right," he said. "I'll need Caleb to help with the upper sections. I'll send Caleb to you after his morning work." She started to turn away. "Miss Carter." His voice stopped her. She looked back. "The lower fence," he said. "While I have materials out, I can take care of that too." "Yes," she said. "Please do." She walked back toward the house. There was no reason for the warmth that moved through her. At that brief exchange, nothing in it that warranted anything more than professional satisfaction. She was getting things done. That was all. That was enough. She told herself that firmly, and almost believed it. The first time Elizabeth made a significant error, it was in front of witnesses. A man named Beaumont Ashford arrived on a Friday afternoon, a land agent from Lexington with an expensive coat, a loud voice, and the practiced ease of someone who was accustomed to being accommodated. He had 2 men with him who stood slightly behind him and slightly to the side. The human furniture of a man who wanted the world to understand that he was attended. Elizabeth met him at the gate because no one else did. "I'm here to speak with the owner of this property," Ashford said, looking her up and down in a way that was meant to establish the precise nature of her position. "The owner is not available," Elizabeth said. "I am the housekeeper. If you have business pertaining to the estate, you may speak with me, or submit correspondence through the accounting office." Ashford looked past her toward the property. "I've made arrangements for a survey of the eastern acreage." Mr. Pruitt indicated. "Mr. Pruitt is not authorized to permit survey access to the property," Elizabeth said. She had no idea if this was strictly accurate, but she had read through every document she could find in the household files, and nothing indicated that the accounting agent had any authority over the land itself. Any survey would require explicit permission from the owner. "My dear woman, Miss Carter," she corrected pleasantly. Ashford's expression tightened. "Miss Carter, I have a letter. I would be happy to receive any letter you have and ensure it reaches the appropriate party." She held out her hand. along with your card, so that I may address any response correctly." There was a pause that Ashford clearly did not enjoy. Behind him, one of his men made a small sound that might have been swallowed amusement. Ashford produced a card and a folded letter, with the stiff movements of a man doing something against his preference. He placed them in her outstretched hand. "This matter is time-sensitive," he said. "I understand," Elizabeth said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ashford." She waited until his horses had cleared the gate. Then she walked directly to find Nathaniel, who was behind the barn with Caleb, sorting lumber for the roof repair. "A man named Ashford was here," she said. "A land agent. He claims to have authorization from Gerald Pruitt to survey the eastern acreage." I turned him away. Nathaniel set down the board he was holding. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before, a stillness deeper than his usual calm. Almost like the moment before weather changed. "You turned him away," he repeated. He had a letter, but no documentation showing proper authorization from the owner. "I told him any survey would require the owner's direct permission." She paused. "Was that wrong?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long, steady moment. "No," he said finally. "That was exactly right." He picked up the board again. "What name did he give you?" "Beaumont Ashford. He said he came from Lexington." Something moved through Nathaniel's face recognition, sharpening to attention. "Did he say anything else?" "About the eastern acreage specifically?" "Only that the matter was time-sensitive." Elizabeth looked at him. "Do you know who he is?" "I know the name." He was quiet for a moment. "Keep that letter. Don't send it to Pruitt, not yet. Keep it here." She wanted to ask why. She wanted to push to understand the thing that was clearly moving behind his steady eyes. But something in his tone, not commanding, not dismissive, simply certain, made her hold the question. "All right," she said. She kept the letter. June moved toward July the way Kentucky summer always did, in slow, pressing heat that turned the mornings thick and the afternoons still. Elizabeth settled into a rhythm. She managed Martha and Caleb with a clear, consistent hand, the kind of management that was specific about expectations and honest about reasons. She maintained the accounts as carefully as she could, with the information available to her. She wrote to Pruitt twice more on matters of household maintenance and received responses that were unhelpful, imprecise, bureaucratic language. She got things done anyway. Nathaniel worked alongside her in the practical sense, not inside the house, but alongside the function of it. He fixed the roof. He repaired the fence. He brought in 2 additional workers from a neighboring farm for a week to cut back the overgrowth along the south side of the property. He was always where the work was, with the same unhurried competence. And he never once complained or explained himself more than was necessary. They developed a habit, unconsciously, of walking the property in the late afternoon, when the worst of the heat had broken. Not together, exactly, it was never arranged. But she would come out to check the kitchen garden, and he would be coming in from the far fields, and they would walk the same direction for a while and talk about what needed doing. It was entirely professional. It was also, she was aware, the conversation she looked forward to most each day. "You're from Lexington?" he asked one afternoon. "Originally from Franklin County," she said. "I moved to Lexington for work when I was 19, and before this position." She was quiet for a moment. She had not offered this information to Martha, or to anyone. But she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want to withhold it from him. "I was dismissed," she said simply. "There was a situation with another member of the staff. A girl 17 in the laundry. She was accused of stealing silver. I knew she hadn't done it. I said so." She paused. Loudly, in front of the family and 2 guests. Nathaniel looked at her sideways. And the silver was later found in the room of the family's youngest son, who had taken it to cover a gambling debt. But by that point I had already been let go. And no one in Lexington was eager to hear a correction. Did the girl keep her position? She did. Elizabeth looked straight ahead. "That matters more than whether I kept mine." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she had come to understand meant he was taking something seriously. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Not for a single moment. He said nothing after that. But when she glanced at him, there was something in his face she couldn't quite name, not pity. Not admiration exactly, but something that looked like recognition. Like someone seeing a thing they had been looking for. She looked away first. It was Caleb who said something that should have made her think more carefully. They were in the kitchen after supper on a Thursday evening, and Elizabeth was going over the supply inventory while Caleb ate the last of the cornbread. He was a good-natured boy, observant in the way that children were when they had been mostly overlooked, and he sometimes said things without realizing how much they contained. "Miss Carter," he said, "do you know Mr. Nathaniel's last name?" Elizabeth looked up from her ledger. "He told me his name was Nathaniel. I assumed Hayes was the family name of the owner." Caleb looked at her with the careful expression of someone deciding whether information was theirs to share. "It is," he said. "It's the family name." He took another bite of cornbread and said nothing further. Elizabeth looked back at her ledger. She turned the sentence over in her mind once. Quickly, "It is the family name," and then filed it in the category of things to examine later. When she had time, when it was not the end of an exhausting day, and the numbers in front of her still needed to agree with each other before morning. She did not examine it that night. She would spend a long time afterward wishing she had. The letter from the accounting office came on a Tuesday morning, not the usual monthly summary, but something different, an announcement. Formal language. Gerald Pruitt's cramped signature at the bottom. It informed the staff of the Hayes property that a group of investors representing several interests would be visiting the estate on the following Friday to conduct an informal assessment of the property. Miss Carter was instructed to ensure the household was presentable and to receive the guests appropriately. The assessment was the letter concluded of a financial nature and had been arranged with the full knowledge of relevant parties. Elizabeth read it at the kitchen table. Martha read it over her shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a word. "What does assessment of a financial nature mean?" Caleb asked from across the table. "It means," Elizabeth said carefully, "that someone wants to determine the value of this property." She set the letter down. For purposes that are not yet entirely clear, she went looking for Nathaniel. She found him at the edge of the south field, where he had been clearing a drainage line that had collapsed in the spring and never been properly addressed. He was working steadily, shovel, wheelbarrow, the patient movement of a man who had done physical labor long enough that it no longer felt like effort. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. And this time, the expression on his face was not the deep stillness she had seen before. It was something else entirely, something that looked, in the brief moment before he controlled it, remarkably like anger. "Pruitt sent this," he said. "Yes, to you. Not to me, yes." He folded the letter with the particular precision of someone restraining themselves. "And Ashford," he said. "The land connected." "I believe so." She watched his face. "Nathaniel, what is happening on this property? Because I have kept that letter, as you asked, and I have been watching the eastern acreage. And now there are investors coming for an assessment, and I am the housekeeper of this estate, and I have a right to understand what I am managing." He looked at her for a long moment. "The owner of this property," he said slowly, "has not been present in the same way he once was. And there are people who believe that makes the property available." "Available," she repeated. "To buy, or to arrange to buy, through mechanisms that don't require the owner's full awareness." He paused. "It's a particular kind of theft," he said, "the kind that happens in legal offices. With documents, with agents who know how to navigate the spaces between what the law says and what it means." Elizabeth felt something cold move through her despite the July heat. "You know a great deal about this for a farmhand." Something shifted in his face. A slight tightening around the eyes. "I know this land," he said simply. She looked at him, this man she had been giving instructions to for 6 weeks. This man who had fixed her roof and mended her fences and appeared every morning where the work was hardest and stayed until it was done. This man whose last name she had not asked, whose full story she had not pursued, because she had been too busy keeping the household together to ask questions she probably should have been asking from the first day. "Nathaniel," she said, "when these investors arrive on Friday, meet them," he said. "Receive them exactly as Pruitt's letter instructs. Be professional, be thorough, and keep your ears open. And you?" "I'll be there," he said. "I'll be where I usually am." She wanted to ask more. She could feel the shape of something she was missing, the edge of an understanding that was almost within reach. But he had already picked up his shovel again, returned his attention to the drainage line. And the moment, if there had been a moment, had passed. She walked back toward the house. The investors were coming on Friday. And Elizabeth Carter had the very strong feeling that what happened on Friday was going to change everything about what she thought she understood about this property. About Gerald Pruitt, and about the quiet man with calloused hands and steady eyes who had told her, on her very first day, that he took care of this land. She had believed him. She still did. She was only beginning to understand how much more that meant than she had ever imagined. Elizabeth did not sleep well on Thursday night. She lay in the small room off the kitchen that had been designated as the housekeeper's quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about drainage lines and legal documents and the particular way. Nathaniel's face had changed when he read Pruitt's letter. Not the stillness she had come to recognize, something sharper than that. Something that had lasted only a moment before he pulled it back behind his usual composure. The way a man covers a wound before anyone can see how deep it goes. She got up before dawn and started on the household. If investors were coming on Friday, then Friday would be met with everything this property had to offer. That was a matter of professional pride, but it was also, she was beginning to understand, something more. Whatever was being arranged, whatever Ashford's survey request and Pruitt's letter, and Nathaniel's carefully controlled anger, added up to she did not intend to meet it with a disordered house and an unready staff. She had Martha make a full inventory of the kitchen before breakfast. She had Caleb sweep and clear every room that visitors might see. She went through the parlor herself, moving furniture, checking surfaces, pulling back curtains that had been drawn so long they had started to stick. She found a ledger in the bottom drawer of the study desk that she had not seen before, not the household accounts, but something older, something with column headings she did not immediately recognize, and she set it aside to look at more carefully when she had time. She did not have time before Friday arrived. The investors came in 2 carriages, which was the first thing she noticed. Not 1, 2. 6 men in total, dressed in the particular way of men who wanted their prosperity to be evident without appearing to try too hard. They arrived at 10 in the morning, 40 minutes ahead of the time Pruitt's letter had specified, which Elizabeth recognized immediately as a tactic. You arrived early to catch a household unprepared. You arrived early to see what people did when they thought they had more time. She was standing at the front entrance when the carriages came through the gate, hands folded, back straight. Behind her, the house was as ready as 6 weeks of catching up could make it. The man who stepped out first was not Beaumont Ashford. Though Ashford was there, he emerged from the second carriage with the look of a man executing a plan he was proud of. The first man was older, 60s perhaps, with silver hair, and the easy authority of someone who had made enough money that he no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. He looked at Elizabeth the way he probably looked at most things, appraisingly. Briefly, efficiently. "You are Miss Carter," he said. It was not a question. "And you are?" "Sir?" "Cornelius Whitmore." He said it like it should mean something to her. Perhaps it did to some people. "I represent a consortium of investors with interests in Harlan County land development. We have an arrangement with Mr. Gerald Pruitt to assess the Hayes property." Mr. Pruitt notified me of your visit, Elizabeth said. He did not, however, provide documentation of any formal arrangement. I would be grateful if you could share that documentation before we proceed. Whitmore stopped. Behind him, Ashford's pleasant expression went slightly rigid. I beg your pardon? Whitmore said. The documentation of your arrangement with Mr. Pruitt, Elizabeth repeated, with the same calm professionalism she used when explaining to a tradesman why his invoice did not match his delivery. A consortium assessing property for potential acquisition would naturally have a formal letter of authorization. I want to ensure I receive you appropriately and that the record of this visit is accurate. There was a silence that stretched like pulled taffy. One of the men behind Whitmore, younger, with a legal-looking satchel under his arm, bent toward Whitmore's ear and said something quietly. Whitmore listened, then looked back at Elizabeth with the recalibrated expression of a man who had underestimated something. We have a letter from Pruitt's office, he said. I would be happy to receive it, she said, and held out her hand. She read it standing there in front of them all. It was from Pruitt's office, signed by Pruitt, and it authorized the Whitmore Consortium to conduct an assessment of the Hayes estate property with a view to, and here the language became very careful, very precise, facilitating a potential transfer of interest in the estate pending confirmation of the owner's intentions. Pending confirmation of the owner's intentions. Elizabeth read that phrase twice. Then she looked up and smiled, the way she had learned to smile when something required a response she had not yet decided on. Gentlemen, she said, please come inside. Martha has prepared refreshments. She brought them into the parlor. She served them coffee. She listened to Whitmore speak about the value of land development in Kentucky, about the consortium's record of improving properties that had fallen into disrepair, about how a professional management arrangement could benefit everyone connected to the estate. He spoke for 20 minutes with the practiced fluency of a man who had given this speech before. Elizabeth nodded at the appropriate moments and said very little. What she was doing primarily was watching the door. He appeared at the window first. She caught the movement from the corner of her eye, because she had been watching for it. Nathaniel stood just outside the parlor window, where anyone inside who glanced that direction would see him. A man in a work shirt, leaning on the window frame with his arms crossed, watching the room, watching Whitmore, watching Ashford. Whitmore noticed him after about a minute. His eyes went to the window, then back to Elizabeth, with the mild dismissal of a man categorizing a farmhand as irrelevant. Ashford noticed him too. Ashford's reaction was different. Ashford looked at Nathaniel, and something crossed his face that Elizabeth, who was watching very carefully, could only describe as discomfort. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The awareness of a man who had expected a room and found instead that there was a witness. Miss Carter, Whitmore said, setting down his coffee cup. We would like to begin with a walk of the eastern acreage, if that is agreeable. It is not, Elizabeth said pleasantly. Another silence. I beg, Mr. Whitmore, I have read your letter from Mr. Pruitt's office carefully, and I appreciate that you have taken the time to come all this way. However, the letter authorizes an assessment of the estate pending confirmation of the owner's intentions. She kept her voice even. I have not received any confirmation from the owner that this assessment is authorized. Until I have that confirmation, I am not in a position to permit access to the property beyond this room. Whitmore looked at her as though he was seeing her for the first time. The owner, he said slowly, is not available. That is precisely why Mr. Pruitt manages the household accounts, Elizabeth said. He does not own this property, and his authorization does not extend to permitting external parties access to the land itself. If you believe otherwise, I would welcome the supporting documentation. From the window. She was aware of Nathaniel watching her. She kept her eyes on Whitmore. Whitmore looked at Ashford. Ashford looked at the table. The man with the legal satchel looked at nothing in particular with the careful expression of a professional who had just realized the situation was more complicated than his client had represented. "Miss Carter," Whitmore said, and his voice had shifted the easy authority, replaced by something cooler. Something with an edge. "You are a housekeeper. You have been employed here." "What, 6 weeks? You are not a lawyer, you are not the owner. And you are not in any position to determine the legal reach of Mr. Pruitt's authority." Elizabeth let that sit in the air for exactly one breath. "You're right," she said. "I am not a lawyer. I am a housekeeper. My position is to manage this household and protect the interests of the estate and its owner." She picked up his coffee cup and set it neatly on the tray. "And that is exactly what I am doing." She stood up. "I will walk you to your carriages, gentlemen." She walked them to the gate. She did it the way she did everything, calmly, directly, without apology. Whitmore was tight-lipped by the time they reached the carriages. Ashford did not look at her. The man with the satchel, however, as he climbed back into the carriage, glanced at her with an expression that she thought, if she was reading it correctly, was something close to reluctant admiration. She stood at the gate until both carriages were out of sight. Then she turned around and Nathaniel was there, not beside her 10 yards back, leaning against the fence post, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Open, unguarded, like a man who had just watched something he had not expected to see. "You sent them away," he said. "They didn't have authorization. Pruitt is going to be very angry." "Pruitt can submit his anger and triplicate," she said. On the 1st of the month. Something happened to Nathaniel's face then. She had seen him careful, and she had seen him controlled, and she had seen the flash of that deeper, contained feeling when things went wrong. But she had not seen him almost smile before a real one. Not the small private expression she'd occasionally caught. This was different. This reached his eyes. "You're not afraid of any of it," he said. "Are you?" She considered the question honestly. "I'm afraid of the wrong things winning," she said. "That's different from being afraid of the people trying to win them." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon was hot and still, and the only sound was insects and distant horses, and the blood moving in her own ears. "Thank you," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. 2 words. She had been thanked before she was thanked routinely. The courteous acknowledgement of service rendered. This was not that. This had weight behind it. This came from somewhere specific in this man. And it landed somewhere specific in her, and she did not entirely know what to do with either of those facts. "It was the right thing to do," she said. "Most people don't do the right thing when it costs them something. What does it cost me?" "If Pruitt pushes hard enough and claims Whitmore had authority," Nathaniel said quietly, "it could cost you this position." She had already thought of that. She had thought of it standing in the parlor, watching Whitmore's expression change from dismissal to anger. And she had made her decision and continued on. "Then it cost me this position," she said. "I've lost a position before for doing the right thing. I'm still standing." He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression, and she had the strange and disorienting feeling that this man she had been giving instructions to, whose work she had been directing, who she had categorized on her first day as the farmhand, saw her more clearly than most people she had ever met. She went back inside before she could examine that feeling too carefully. The letter from Pruitt arrived on Monday. It was, as Nathaniel had predicted, angry. Not dramatically so. Pruitt was too careful for drama, but angry in the particular bureaucratic way that was actually more threatening than shouting. It informed Elizabeth that she had exceeded her authority. It informed her that the consortium's visit had been properly authorized. It informed her that the owner had been apprised of the situation, this phrase carefully vague about what apprised meant and how, and that further obstruction of legitimate business activities pertaining to the estate would be grounds for termination of her employment. Elizabeth read it at the kitchen table. Martha was at the stove. Caleb was outside. That bad? Martha said, without turning around. Manageable, Elizabeth said. She wrote back that same afternoon. Her response was 3 paragraphs. It stated clearly that she had requested and not received documentation establishing that Mr. Pruitt had authority to permit third-party access to the estate's land, that she had acted within the bounds of her position in protecting the estate's interests, and that she would welcome a meeting with the owner directly to clarify the boundaries of her authority and Mr. Pruitt's in matters relating to the property. She addressed the envelope to the accounting office. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was in the barn, checking one of the horses for a leg issue Caleb had reported that morning. He heard her come in and didn't look up from what he was doing, his hands moving carefully along the animal's lower leg. Pruitt's letter came, she said. I expected it. He's threatening termination if I obstruct any further legitimate business activities. She paused. I wrote back and asked for a meeting with the owner to clarify the chain of authority. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. His hand stilled on the horse's leg. You asked to meet the owner? Yes, in writing. To Pruitt's office? Yes, he stood up slowly. Turned to look at her. There was something in his face she had not seen before. And she could not name it precisely, not the almost smile from Friday. Not the controlled anger from the letter, not the deep stillness. It was something more complicated than any of those things. Like several feelings arriving at once from different directions and not yet resolved into a single expression. Miss Carter, he said, and his voice was careful in a way it had never been with her before. She waited. He seemed to make a decision. Then he seemed to unmake it. His jaw tightened slightly. The owner will receive your letter, he said finally. How can you be certain of that? A pause that lasted too long. I know him, he said. She looked at him steadily. You know the owner of this property? Yes. Well enough to be certain my letter reaches him. Yes, she held his gaze. There was something here, something in the space between his words and the thing he was not saying, and she was close enough to it to feel its shape without yet being able to see it clearly. Is there something you should tell me? She asked. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Not yet, he said. The words were quiet, but they were honest. She could hear that. Not an evasion, but a deferral, with the weight of intention behind it. All right, she said. She walked back to the house. That night, she took out the old ledger she had set aside from the study drawer, the one with the unfamiliar column headings, and looked at it more carefully. It was a property record of some kind, she realized. Land grants, acreage, dates going back 20 years. Hayes Land and the names associated with it. Nathaniel. The name appeared several times, in connection with various property decisions. Not as a witness, not as a laborer, as a decision-maker. She stared at it for a long time. Then she put it away and went to bed and lay there with the ceiling overhead and the sound of summer outside and a realization she was not yet fully willing to look at directly turning quietly in the center of her chest. In the days that followed, something shifted between them, nothing that either of them named or addressed directly, but a change in temperature, in the way they moved around each other. She had always been professional with him. She remained professional. But the conversation stretched a little longer in the afternoons. He began occasionally to ask her opinion on things beyond the immediate household, the state of the tenant arrangements on the southern portion of the land, the situation of a family named Dobbins, who had been farming a section of the eastern acreage for 11 years, and apparently had no formal written agreement protecting their position. That's what Ashford's survey was about, Elizabeth said one evening, when he raised the Dobbins situation. If there's no formal documentation of their arrangement, a sale of that acreage could displace them entirely. Yes, Nathaniel said. How many families are in that situation on this property? He was quiet for a moment. 4 that I know of, possibly more on the eastern section that Pruitt manages directly. Elizabeth thought about that. 4 families. People who had been farming this land possibly for years. possibly for generations on the strength of informal arrangements that gave them no protection if the land changed hands. People who could wake up one morning to find that a consortium from Lexington had acquired the ground under their feet, legally through documents they had never seen. That's what this is really about, she said. It wasn't a question. The land has value, Nathaniel said. There are people who have been watching it for a while, waiting for an opening. An opening created by the owner being, she chose the word carefully, disengaged. Nathaniel looked at the middle distance. Something like that. And the owner, she said. Does he know about the families? About the Dobbinses and the others? He does now, Nathaniel said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking back at her. And in that look, in the particular steadiness of it, in the weight of those two words, she felt the shape of what she had been avoiding, looking at directly move closer to the surface. He does now. Not I'll tell him, he does now. Present tense. Immediate. She took a breath. Nathaniel, she said. Miss Carter, I want to ask you something directly. He didn't look away. All right. She held his gaze. Are you the owner of this property? The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever stood inside. It was not an empty silence, it was full. She could feel him in it. The decision he was making, the thing he had been carrying since the day she had walked up that road with her trunk and asked him if he was the farmhand. And before he could answer, there were hoofbeats on the drive. Not one horse. Moving fast. Caleb appeared at the edge of the yard. Running, Miss Carter. There's men coming and one of them's Mr. Pruitt. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. His face had gone to that deep, particular stillness. Don't say anything to Pruitt that you wouldn't put in writing, he said quietly. Whatever he tells you, whatever he asks, treat it the same way you treated Whitmore. And you, she said. I'll be close. She turned toward the drive, her heart hammering in a way she refused to let reach her face. Gerald Pruitt was exactly as she had imagined him from his letters, a compact, impatient man in his late 40s with the pinched look of someone perpetually frustrated by other people's failure to do what he had arranged. He had two men with him, both younger, both with the manner of legal clerks. He did not dismount gracefully. Miss Carter, he said, before he had fully found his footing. I have come in person because your recent correspondence has made it abundantly clear that you do not understand the limits of your position, Mr. Pruitt, she said. You've traveled a long way. Please come inside. I will not be coming inside, he said. This will not take long. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. This is formal notice that your conduct in turning away Mr. Whitmore's consortium has cost this estate a significant business opportunity. You are hereby informed that your employment is under review, pending a conversation with the relevant parties. Elizabeth did not take the document. Mr. Pruitt, she said evenly, who are the relevant parties? He stopped. Blinked. I beg your pardon? The relevant parties to my employment review. You represent the accounting interests of this estate. My employment was arranged through the household, not through your office. I am asking you to identify specifically who has authorized this review. Pruitt stared at her. Behind him, one of the young clerks shifted his weight. The owner. Pruitt started. Has the owner authorized this review in writing? She asked. Or are you acting on the assumption of authority? The word assumption landed the way she intended it to precisely. With full awareness of what it implied, Pruitt's face went very still. Young woman, he said, and his voice had dropped to something low and deliberate. You have been an employee of this estate for fewer than 2 months. You have turned away a legitimate business consortium. You have written to my office making demands, and now you are standing here questioning my authority. He stepped forward. I am telling you with all the patience I have to step aside and allow the business of this estate to proceed. The business of this estate, a voice said from behind Elizabeth, is not yours to define. She did not need to turn around to know who had spoken. But she turned anyway. Nathaniel was walking from the direction of the barn. And he was not hurrying. He walked the same way he always walked, with that unhurried, undefended pace, the walk that did not apologize for itself. He had not changed his clothes. He was still in the work shirt. The rolled sleeves, the dusty boots of a man who had been working on the land. But Pruitt went pale. It happened instantly, the color draining from the man's face, the way color left a room when a lamp went out. He stared at Nathaniel, and his mouth opened, and what came out was not an argument or a directive or any of the carefully organized language he had arrived with. What came out was 2 syllables. Mr. Hayes. Elizabeth heard them. Mr. Hayes. She stood very still. Nathaniel stopped walking when he reached her side. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her, exactly level with her. He looked at Pruitt with an expression Elizabeth could not remember seeing on his face before, because she had only ever seen it aimed at fence posts and drainage lines and the ordinary problems of a working day. It was authority, not the performed kind that Whitmore had carried into her parlor, not the bureaucratic kind that Pruitt had arrived with. The settled, certain authority of a man standing on his own land. "Gerald," he said, "we need to talk." Pruitt's mouth was still open. "Inside," Nathaniel said, without the clerks. He glanced at the 2 young men, who immediately found the middle distance very interesting. Then he looked at Elizabeth. "If you'll join us, Miss Carter." His voice was the same voice. The same even unhurried tone he used when he was deciding how much of an answer to give. She looked at him. She looked at this man she had directed and instructed and managed and walked alongside in the late afternoons. This man whose last name she had not asked. This man who had carried her trunk on her first day and told her he took care of this land. She understood now what that had meant. She kept her face exactly as she needed it to be, professional, composed, giving nothing away, and she said, "Of course," and she walked into the house between them. But her mind was already 3 steps ahead, and 4 years' worth of assumptions were rebuilding themselves from the ground up. And somewhere under the professionalism and the composure and the forward momentum, a feeling she could not yet name was moving through her like water, finding the level it had always been meant to find. She had asked him, not 5 minutes ago, if he was the owner of this property. He had not answered. He was answering now. The study at the back of the house was a room Elizabeth had cleaned twice and entered a dozen times for household purposes. But she had never sat in it before. She sat in it now, in the chair nearest the door, not hiding, not retreating, but positioning herself exactly where she needed to be to see everything clearly. Nathaniel sat behind the desk. Not because he moved to it dramatically or made a point of it, he simply walked in and sat down, the way a man sits at his own desk in his own house. The naturalness of it hit her somewhere specific, the way the obvious always did once you finally saw it. Of course he sat there. Of course he moved through this house the way he did. Of course he knew where everything was, why everything had gone wrong, what Pruitt had and had not been authorized to do. Of course, Pruitt stood across from him. The clerks were outside. Martha had taken one look at the procession coming through friction, removed her and Caleb with the discretion of a woman who had survived many years in other people's households. The room was quiet. Nathaniel looked at Pruitt with the same eyes he had turned on fence posts and drainage ditches, steady, evaluating, deciding what needed doing. "Sit down." "Gerald," he said. Pruitt sat. He looked like a man reassembling himself from the inside, pulling the pieces of his authority back together after they had scattered across the yard when Nathaniel spoke his name. It was not a comfortable process to watch. "You were not supposed to be here," Pruitt said. His voice had recovered some of its precision. "The understanding was that you had removed yourself from active management." "I removed myself from the Lexington house," Nathaniel said. "I didn't remove myself from this land. The arrangement with Whitmore was not authorized." Nathaniel's voice did not rise. "It did not need to. You had no authority to permit a survey of the eastern acreage, Gerald. You had no authority to facilitate any transfer discussion without my explicit written consent. You know this." Pruitt's jaw tightened. The estate has been without effective management for 18 months. The land is depreciating, the household. The household, Nathaniel said, is being managed effectively, as you were informed. His eyes moved briefly to Elizabeth, then back to Pruitt. Miss Carter's reports have been reaching me. Elizabeth went very still. She turned that sentence over in her head slowly, the way you turned something delicate that you didn't want to drop. Her reports had been reaching him. She had been writing to Pruitt's office. Routine household correspondence supply requests. Maintenance records. The monthly accounting summaries she prepared. She had not written directly to the owner, because she had been told the owner was unavailable for correspondence. But Nathaniel Mr. Hayes had been receiving her reports. He had been reading her letters. He had known this whole time exactly what she was doing in his house. She kept her face level. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept breathing. "You've been here," Pruitt said to Nathaniel, and now his voice had an edge that was almost accusation. "All this time you've been on the property." "I have, as a laborer." "Without identifying yourself." "As someone who wanted to understand the true state of my own land," Nathaniel said. "Without the filter of your monthly summaries, Gerald. Which, as I have been discovering, have not been entirely accurate." The silence that followed was a different kind, heavier, with more underneath it. Pruitt said nothing. Elizabeth watched him say nothing and understood that the silence itself was an answer. "The Dobbins family," Nathaniel said. "The Hargraves. The widow Macready on the eastern section. The Tunstall family with the 3 children." He said each name like he was placing a stone on a table. "Their arrangements with this estate are not documented in your summaries. They don't appear in the accounts you send me. But they are here. Gerald, they have been here. And Whitmore's consortium, which you arranged access for, would have cleared every one of them off this land inside of a year." Pruitt's composure cracked. Not completely, he was too practiced for that, but at the edges. "The consortium offered a fair price for the eastern acreage. The families would have been compensated. By whom?" Nathaniel's voice sharpened for the first time. "They have no written agreements. They would have had no legal standing. Whatever Whitmore chose to give them, if anything, would have been his decision, not mine." He leaned forward slightly. "Were you compensated, Gerald? For the arrangement?" The crack in Pruitt's composure widened. "I want to see the actual accounts," Nathaniel said. "Not the summaries. The actual books. All of them. By the end of this week. That is, there are protocols. The end of this week," Nathaniel repeated. "Or I will engage a lawyer from Louisville to review everything from the past 3 years. Your choice." Pruitt stood up. His movements were stiff with the effort of maintaining some version of his dignity. "This is irregular," he said. The proper channel, Nathaniel said quietly, "is that this is my land, and you work for me, and you will do what I have asked. Thank you for coming out, Gerald. I'll expect the books by Friday." Pruitt left. They heard him speak briefly to his clerks in the yard. They heard hoofbeats departing, and then the house settled back into its summer quiet. And it was only the 2 of them in the study, and Elizabeth was sitting very precisely in her chair, with her hands folded in her lap and about 4 years' worth of professional composure working very hard at its job. Nathaniel sat back. He looked at her. He did not say anything immediately. Neither did she. Outside, a bird called once. The clock on the mantelpiece moved through several seconds. "You knew," she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that. "Not everything," he said. "Not immediately. I arrived here 2 weeks before you did. I'd been in Lexington. I had family business, legal matters. When I came back and saw the state the property was in, I needed to understand it from the inside, not as the owner. As someone who could actually see what was happening without everyone performing a version of it for my benefit." "So you were here," she said. "You were working on the fences and the roof and the drainage line." "Yes, and then I arrived." "Yes, and asked if you were the farmhand." "Yes." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not the almost smile, something more serious than that. Something that carried weight. "And you let me believe it," she said. "I didn't correct it," he said. "Those are different things." "Are they?" It was not a question. She said it in the flat, honest way of someone who was working through what they actually believed, rather than reaching for a prepared position. He looked at her steadily. "I know what you're going to say. I doubt that. You're going to say that the effect was the same, regardless of intent. That you operated under a false understanding, and that I permitted it." She looked at him. "Is that wrong?" "No," he said, "it's not wrong." He held her gaze without flinching from it. "It was also the first time in 4 years that anyone on this property spoke to me like a person, rather than a ledger entry. The first time anyone told me what actually needed fixing, without first calculating how the information would serve them." He paused. "You told me the roof was pulling away from the ridge beam on the second day you were here. Not because you were trying to impress me, because it needed to be fixed." Elizabeth breathed in slowly. She understood what he was saying. She could feel the truth of it, the particular loneliness of a person whose position meant that everyone around them was always managing what they revealed. That did not mean she was not angry. "My monthly reports," she said. "They were reaching you." "Yes. So you read them." "Everyone, in the letter I wrote requesting authorization for the east roof repair using materials already in inventory." "I thought that was clever," he said. "I thought I was writing to a bureaucrat in an accounting office." Her voice stayed even. "I thought I was navigating a system that had no real owner at the end of it. I thought—" She stopped, reordered herself. "I made decisions based on what I understood the situation to be. Some of those decisions were significant, and the situation was not what I understood it to be." "No," he said. "It wasn't. You watched me turn Whitmore away." "I did. You were at the window. I was, and you knew who they were. You knew what they were attempting, and you let me face them without telling me what I was actually standing against." Something in his face shifted a genuine discomfort. The specific kind that came from being faced with the accurate account of your own choices. "You're right," he said. "That was I should have told you before they came. I had decided to. And then they arrived early and you were already at the door. And you handled it completely without my help." "That is not the point," she said. "No, it isn't." He looked at her directly. "Miss Carter. What I did was not— I did not intend to use you or to place you in danger. But I understand that my intent does not determine the reality of your experience. And your experience was that you were making significant decisions in a situation you were not fully informed about." A pause. "I'm sorry for that." Elizabeth sat with those words for a moment. She was not someone who accepted apologies quickly. She thought they deserved the same honest evaluation as any other statement. She turned this one over and found it genuine, unperformed. The kind of apology that did not ask for immediate absolution. "All right," she said. He looked slightly surprised. "I'm not finished being angry," she clarified. "But I believe the apology that did." Finally, bring out the real version of his smile, the one that reached his eyes. Unexpected as weather turning from gray to gold. It lasted only a moment before he pulled it back, aware of the seriousness of what was still between them. "What happens now?" she asked. "I need to go through the actual accounts. I need to get legal documentation in place for the tenant families before Pruitt has time to arrange anything further." He looked at the desk. "And I need to decide what to do about Gerald." "He was taking money from the consortium," Elizabeth said. "Almost certainly. Can you prove it?" "With the actual books?" "Possibly. With a lawyer and some time, probably." He looked at her. "You said you kept Ashford's letter. It's in my desk. That's evidence of the consortium's attempt to access the property without authorization. It establishes a timeline." He thought for a moment. "Would you be willing to provide a written account of everything that happened Ashford's visit?" "Whitmore's visit, what was said, what was requested?" "Yes," she said immediately. He looked at her. "It may mean involvement in a legal proceeding. I understand. It may mean conflict with Pruitt and potentially with people who have more resources than he does. Mr. Hayes. She met his eyes. I was dismissed from my last position for telling a powerful family that their son had stolen from their own laundry maid. I am not afraid of conflict with people who have resources. What I am afraid of is the wrong thing winning. She paused. You said something like that to me once, or close to it. I did, he said quietly. Though if I recall, it was you who said it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had carried her trunk on the first day. Who had fixed the roof she had asked him to fix. Who had eaten cornbread on an upturned crate and watched the evening sky and answered her questions with the minimum of words necessary. Who had read her letters and watched her work and never once, in 6 weeks, given her any reason to think she was being managed or performed for, because he hadn't been doing those things. He had been doing something else entirely. Seeing her. The same way, she understood now, that she had been seeing him. She stood up. I'll get Ashford's letter, she said. And I'll write out everything I can document about both visits. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Miss Carter. She was at the door when he spoke again. Elizabeth. She turned. It was the first time he had used her given name. What I told you the day Whitmore left, he said. When I said most people don't do the right thing when it costs them something. He held her gaze. I meant it. I had been watching for a long time to see if there was anyone on this land who would. She stood in the doorway and looked at this man and felt the full, complicated weight of 6 weeks rearranging itself, in her understanding not collapsing. Not falling apart, but reforming into something that was more true than what she had thought it was. And therefore more significant. You found one, she said. Then she went to write the letters. The next 2 days moved fast. Nathaniel Hayes, and she made herself use the full name in her thoughts now. Made herself hold both parts of it together. The man at the fence post and the man at his own desk rode to Harlantown on Saturday morning. He went to a lawyer named Samuel Cord, who had an office above the dry goods store and had apparently been acquainted with the Hayes family for 2 decades. Elizabeth knew this because Nathaniel told her before he left, which was itself a shift. He told her things now. Not everything, not all at once, but he told her what was relevant. What she needed to know to do her part of the work. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. While he was gone, she was not idle. She interviewed each of the 4 tenant families, traveling to them on foot or by the estate's single working wagon. She explained who she was and what she was doing with the directness she applied to everything. And she asked each family to tell her, in their own words, the nature of their arrangement with the Hayes estate. She wrote everything down in a clean hand, in a new ledger she had purchased from town specifically for this purpose. The Dobbins family had been on their section of land for 9 years, on a verbal agreement with Nathaniel's father. The Hargraves for 14. The widow Macready had a single letter, written years ago and unsigned, that referenced an arrangement. The Tunstall family had nothing in writing at all, just the understanding, passed down from one handshake to the next, that they were permitted to farm the eastern quarter in exchange for a portion of the harvest. 4 families, decades of presence on this land, 0 legal protection. She brought all of it back to the house and had it organized on the study desk before Nathaniel returned from town. He came in late afternoon, covered in the dust of a long ride, and stopped in the study doorway when he saw what she had done. He looked at the organized ledger, the documented accounts, the 4 separate statements she had transcribed carefully from her notes. He was quiet for a moment. The Tunstall said they've been here 17 years, she said. Not 14, I went back to double-check with the oldest son. 17, he repeated quietly. Yes, their original arrangement was with your father. Something moved through his face at that, too quick and too private for her to read, but real and deep. He crossed to the desk, picked up the Tunstall statement. Read it through. My father believed that a man's word was his bond, he said. He thought that was enough. It may have been enough in his time, Elizabeth said carefully. It is not enough now. He set the paper down. Cord is going to draw up formal tenancy agreements for all 4 families. Proper documentation, legal standing, clear terms. He looked at her. He also confirmed what I suspected about Pruitt. There are payments in the consortium's records, not in the estate accounts. In their records that correspond to dates when Pruitt made specific decisions about property access. Elizabeth absorbed this. So there is documentation, enough to bring him before a county magistrate. He looked directly at her. Cord wants to hold a formal hearing, not a criminal proceeding, a civil accountability hearing. It would be public. Whitmore's consortium would be named. Pruitt would be named. He paused. You would likely be asked to give testimony about both visits. I already said I would. This is more than I described before. This would be public testimony, in front of a magistrate. In a county where Whitmore has considerable influence. She met his gaze. Mr. Hayes, I gave public testimony in Lexington in front of a family who employed half the household staff in the city. I had no lawyer, no documentation, and nothing to support me except the truth and my own certainty about it. She paused. Give me the documentation and the lawyer and I will do considerably better. He looked at her for a long moment. You are the most formidable person I have met in years, he said. Possibly ever. I am a housekeeper, she said. You are the person who is going to help me save this land and the people on it, he said. I would appreciate it if you would let me call that what it is. Elizabeth looked down at the ledger on the desk. She thought about the Tunstall family, 17 years on a handshake. She thought about the widow Macready with her single unsigned letter. She thought about Caleb, sleeping in the barn, because no one had made arrangements for him inside the house. Because the whole system of this property had been quietly failing the people it was supposed to protect. One small neglect at a time. All right, she said. Call it what it is. He nodded. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Cord wants to use the estate documents you've been compiling as the foundation of the record. Your report, your account of the visits, the Ashford letter, the Pruitt correspondence. I'll have everything organized. He also wants to take your statement directly. He'll come here on Wednesday. I'll be here. She started to gather the papers to put them in order. Elizabeth, she looked up. Why did you come here, he asked. Not accusatorially, with the honest curiosity of a man asking a question he genuinely did not know the answer to. When you were dismissed from Lexington, you had 15 letters out. You could have waited for something closer to home, something safer. Why did you take a position in Harlan County with a property that had driven away its previous housekeeper? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because it was the only response I received, she said. And because I needed the work. That's the practical answer. She looked at him steadily. I also thought a property that far out with that many problems probably needed someone who actually knew how to solve them. And I do. She paused. And I thought that a household where the previous housekeeper left because things were too difficult was probably a household where no one had tried being properly difficult right back. Something lit in his eyes. And were you right? I drove away a land consortium and held a bureaucrat accountable for his paperwork, she said. I'd say the approach had merit. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before. It was a real one, unguarded, startled out of him. The kind that a man produced when he hadn't expected to, and therefore hadn't built any defenses against it. It lasted only a moment, but it changed the temperature of the room entirely. And Elizabeth Carter, who was a professional woman with a professional's well-maintained composure, felt something shift in her chest that she chose, firmly and deliberately, not to look at directly, not yet. There was too much still to do. Cord arrived on Wednesday as promised. He was a sharp-eyed man in his early 60s, with the deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades making sure every word he said was exactly the word he meant. He shook Elizabeth's hand when she was introduced. which not every lawyer of his generation did when meeting a housekeeper. And he sat across from her at the kitchen table with a blank ledger and looked at her with the frank, professional attention of someone who had already decided she was worth his time. "Tell me about the first visit," he said. "Ashford. Start from when the wagon came through the gate." She told him everything. She told it the way she wrote clearly, in order, with attention to what was said and by whom and under what circumstances. Cord wrote steadily and asked clarifying questions that were precise and well-aimed. The questions of a man who already understood what he was building and needed her to hand him the right materials. Nathaniel sat in the corner of the room and did not interrupt. She was aware of him the entire time. Not in a way that distracted her, it was almost the opposite. There was something steadying about the knowledge that he was there. That he had heard all of this before, that he already knew what she was saying was true. When she finished with Whitmore's visit the parlor, the coffee, the authorization letter, the precise language of her refusal, Cord set down his pen and looked at her. "Miss Carter," he said, "in your professional opinion, what was Whitmore's consortium attempting to accomplish?" "A transfer of the eastern acreage," she said. "Using Pruitt's authority as a proxy for the owner's consent. In a situation where the owner was believed to be sufficiently disengaged that the discrepancy might not be noticed until the paperwork was already filed." Cord looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. Cord looked back at Elizabeth. "And you refused them access based on your assessment of Pruitt's authority." "Based on the documentation they could produce," she said, "which did not include anything establishing Pruitt's authority over the land itself. And if they had such documentation," she thought about it honestly, "I would have asked to verify it through an independent source before permitting access," she said. "Because the pattern of behavior I had observed the early arrival, the assumption that I could be managed out of the way." Ashford's specific discomfort when he saw Nathaniel at the window suggested that the documentation itself might not be what it claimed to be. Cord was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel," he said, without turning around, "this woman is better than the last 3 lawyers I hired." "I know," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth kept her face professional. "The hearing," Cord explained, "was in 2.5 weeks. The magistrate was a man named Holloway, who was known to be scrupulously fair and immune to Whitmore's social influence in a way that most of the county wasn't. Pruitt had been notified that the estate's accounts were under review and had responded predictably with a letter to Cord's office that was full of legal language but thin on actual substance. 2 of the consortium's investors had already quietly withdrawn their participation. "Rats leaving the ship," Cord said, "which is useful. It suggests they understand the ship has a hole in it." "Pruitt will bring a lawyer," Nathaniel said. "He already has, a man from Lexington named Furness. Furness is competent and expensive, which tells me Pruitt has resources he hasn't declared in the estate accounts." Cord closed his ledger. "Which is, itself, evidence." After Cord left, Elizabeth stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where they had been sitting and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the weight of what was actually happening. There was a hearing in 2.5 weeks. She would testify. The families on this land, the Dobbinses and the Hargraves and the widow Macready and the Tunstalls, with their 17 years and their handshake, would have a chance at real documentation, real protection. Nathaniel came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." She looked at him. "Are you?" He considered it. "I have been better," he said honestly. "This what Pruitt did. What he was arranging it happened because I stepped back. Because I was grieving, and I stepped back and I let the distance grow between me and this land and the people on it. That's mine to carry." She looked at him carefully. She had not asked about the grief. She knew there was something there Martha had mentioned. In passing the death of his wife, and she had filed it and not pressed, and had not yet understood how much it had shaped the specific shape of his isolation. "You came back," she said. "Yes. And now you're fixing it." He was quiet for a moment. "We're fixing it," he said. She held his gaze. The word "we" moved through her quietly. Settling somewhere, it felt like it had always been meant to go. The morning of the hearing came gray and warm, the way Kentucky mornings did in late summer, when rain was thinking about arriving but hadn't committed yet. Elizabeth was dressed and ready before anyone else in the house. She had her organized documents, every letter, every account, every transcribed statement in a leather case that Nathaniel had produced from somewhere in the house and pressed on her without comment. She had dressed carefully and plainly, the way she always dressed for situations that required her to be taken seriously. Martha pressed coffee on her. Caleb looked at her with wide eyes and said, "Are you going to beat them, Miss Carter?" "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "Same thing," said Martha. Nathaniel came in from the yard, in clothes that were, she noticed, filing it away clean and well cut and very clearly not work clothes. A coat, a proper waistcoat, boots that had been polished. He looked like what he was. He looked like the owner of this land. He looked at her, and she could see the awareness in his eyes that she was seeing this version of him fully, clearly, without the frame of the work shirt and the fence post. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They drove to Harlantown in the estate's good carriage, which Caleb had cleaned and prepared the night before, with the serious attention of a boy who understood that something important was happening. The hearing room above Cord's office was already full when they arrived. Elizabeth had not expected that. She had imagined a small procedural gathering, the magistrate, the lawyers, the relevant parties. What she found was something considerably more populated. 30 or 40 people crowded into benches and chairs, with more standing along the walls. Harlan County, apparently, had been paying attention to the situation at the Hayes estate for longer than she had realized. She felt the eyes when she walked in. She was used to that, the housekeeper arriving with the landowner, the woman who had turned away Whitmore's consortium, the woman who had stood at the gate and sent Pruitt away without what he came for. She walked with her back straight and her leather case under her arm, and she did not look at anyone except Cord, who was already at the front of the room and caught her eye and nodded. Pruitt was already there. He sat at a table on the left side of the room with a man Elizabeth assumed was Furnace Broad, well-dressed, with the self-satisfied ease of someone who charged by the hour, and billed thoroughly. Whitmore was in the back row, which surprised her. She had not expected him to come. She met his eyes briefly and he looked away first. Ashford was not there. Cord leaned close and murmured, "Ashford left the county 3 days ago," which is its own kind of statement. Magistrate Holloway was a tall, thin man with the manner of someone who had presided over enough human disagreements to find them neither surprising nor interesting. He called the room to order with a single knock of his gavel and looked around once, and the room went quiet. "This is a civil accountability hearing," he said. "We are here to examine the conduct of Gerald Pruitt as accounting agent for the Hayes estate, and specifically the arrangements he entered into with the Whitmore Consortium regarding access to Hayes property. This is not a criminal proceeding. It is a proceeding of record. Everything said here will be documented. Everyone who is here to watch is here to listen, not to participate." He looked at the back rows briefly. "We will begin with the documentation." Cord presented first. He was methodical, organized, relentless in the pleasant way of a man who loved a good paper trail. He submitted Elizabeth's account of Ashford's visit, Whitmore's visit, the Pruitt correspondence. He submitted the consortium's own records, which he had obtained through Holloway's authority, showing payments to a private account that matched Pruitt's declared banking institution. He submitted the estate's actual property accounts against the summaries Pruitt had been sending, with a clear numerical analysis of what was in one and absent from the other. Elizabeth listened to all of it and watched Pruitt's lawyer make notes and watched Pruitt himself. And what she saw in Pruitt's face over the course of 45 minutes was not defiance. It was the incremental recognition that the room was not going to go the way he had expected. Then Holloway called her. She walked to the front of the room with the leather case and sat in the chair that had been placed for witnesses and looked at Holloway, who looked back at her with the measured attention of a fair man. "Miss Carter," he said, "you are the housekeeper of the Hayes estate." "I am, tell me." "In your own words, about the morning of Beaumont Ashford's visit." She told him. She had told this story before to Cord, to Nathaniel, to herself in the organizing of documents on late evenings. She knew its shape. She told it the way she knew it, clearly and precisely, without embellishment and without omission. She told it the way she had learned to tell hard truths in Lexington, looking directly at the person who needed to hear it. Voice steady, words chosen for accuracy. When she finished, Furness stood to question her. He was skilled. She had expected that. He tried to establish that she had exceeded her authority, that she had made decisions beyond the scope of a housekeeper's position, that her refusal of access to Whitmore's consortium had been based on personal judgment rather than legitimate grounds. He circled these points with the practiced ease of a man who did this for a living. She answered each question directly. "Miss Carter, you are a housekeeper, not a lawyer. By what authority did you determine that, Mr. Pruitt's authorization was insufficient? By reading the documentation Whitmore provided and finding that it referenced Pruitt's authority in general terms, without specifying his authority over the land itself," she said. "I did not need to be a lawyer to read what the document said and identify what it did not say. And in your professional judgment, my professional judgment is that I am responsible for the management and protection of the household and estate I serve. When men arrive claiming authorization to survey land, I am obligated to verify that authorization. I attempted to verify it. The documentation did not support it. I acted accordingly." Furness looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating. "Did anyone instruct you to turn the consortium away?" "No." "Did the owner instruct you to deny access?" She paused for exactly one breath. "The owner," she said, "had entrusted the management of the household to my professional judgment. I exercised it." From somewhere in the rows behind her, she heard a sound that might have been Nathaniel. Furness looked at his notes. No further questions. Holloway looked at her. "Thank you, Miss Carter." She walked back to her seat. Nathaniel was next. He stood and walked to the front of the room, and she watched the room watch him. There was a shift when he stood, not dramatic but real. The room rearranged itself around the fact of who he was. People who had known the Hayes name and never seen the man. People who had heard there was trouble at the Hayes estate. People who had come to watch and were now seeing the actual shape of what they'd come for. He sat down. He looked at Holloway with the same even steadiness he brought to everything. "Mr. Hayes," Holloway said, "you have been present on your own property for approximately 8 weeks. Yes, in what capacity?" "During that time?" Nathaniel looked at Holloway. "As the owner," he said. "Working the land." A murmur moved through the room. "You did not identify yourself as the owner to the household staff during that period." "I identified myself by my given name. I did not advertise my full identity." "No, why not?" Nathaniel's gaze moved briefly to Elizabeth, then back to Holloway. "Because I wanted to understand the true state of my own land," he said, "without the performance that tends to surround a landowner's presence. I wanted to know what was actually happening." He paused. "I learned a great deal, including the consortium arrangements. I was aware of the consortium's interest before I returned to the property. Their approach to Pruitt was something I had suspected for some time. Coming back confirmed it." Furness stood to question him. He was less skilled with Nathaniel than he had been with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth could see him recalibrate within the first 2 exchanges. Nathaniel answered questions the same way he did everything, with the minimum necessary words and the maximum possible accuracy, and a steadiness that was impossible to rattle, because it came from somewhere genuine rather than somewhere performed. "Mr. Hayes, Were you aware that your housekeeper was making decisions that exceeded her stated authority? Miss Carter's authority as estate housekeeper includes protection of the estate's interests, Nathaniel said. She did not exceed it. She defined its limits accurately in a situation where others were attempting to exploit ambiguity. I authorized everything she did, retrospectively and unreservedly. Retrospectively, Furness said. Leaning on the word, and unreservedly, Nathaniel said. When it was over, when Holloway had heard all of it, and Furness had done what he could, and Pruitt had offered his own account, which was thin and defensive and not well served by the numbers Cord had placed in front of the room, Holloway called a brief recess and then delivered his finding. Pruitt had acted beyond his authority. The arrangements with the Whitmore Consortium had no legal standing. The consortium's access to the property was formally denied on the record. The estate's actual accounts were to be reviewed by an independent party, with findings submitted to Holloway's office within 30 days. Pruitt's employment as accounting agent for the Hayes estate was terminated, effective immediately by the order of the estate's owner. The room made noise. Elizabeth sat still in the middle of it and felt the sound move around her like weather and held the leather case in her lap and breathed. She had done this before, stood at the end of a hard truth and felt the particular quiet that came after the necessary thing had finally been said out loud in front of people who needed to hear it. She knew this feeling. She had never felt it with quite this much at stake. Nathaniel sat back down beside her when it was done. The room was still loud, people talking, moving, the general noise of a proceeding concluding. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then very quietly, so only she could hear, "You were extraordinary." She looked straight ahead. "I told the truth," she said. "That's all I ever do, I know," he said. "That's what makes it extraordinary." She did not trust herself to respond to that. Outside, through the window, the rain that had been thinking about arriving all morning had finally made its decision. The rain came down hard on the ride home. Neither of them spoke much. Nathaniel drove, and Elizabeth sat beside him on the carriage bench with her leather case across her lap. And the rain hit the roof above them in steady, serious sheets. And the road back to the estate turned soft and dark under the wheels. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that came after something large had happened, and both people involved were still inside it. Still turning it over, still finding its edges. Martha had supper ready when they arrived. She took one look at their faces, not bad news, but something heavy. Something that needed sitting down with, and put food on the table, without comment or question. Which was exactly the right thing to do. Caleb ate quickly and disappeared with the sensitivity of a boy who understood when adults needed the room. Which impressed Elizabeth, and made her think someone had taught him that. Or he had learned it through long observation of people not giving him enough credit. They ate. The rain kept on. "Cord will submit the independent accounting review request to Holloway tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "How long will that take?" 30 days for the first report. "Possibly longer if the books are as complicated as I expect they are." He looked at his plate. Gerald was careful. He's been doing this for years. "The discrepancies are real, but they're buried." "Buried means findable," Elizabeth said. "Yes." He looked up. "It does." She poured more coffee without being asked for him first, then herself, and it was only afterward, setting the pot back down, that she noticed the small domesticity of it and felt a mild, private surprise at how natural it had seemed. "The families," she said. "The tenants. When do the formal agreements get drawn up?" "Cord is drafting them this week. He'll bring them out for signatures by the end of next week." Nathaniel turned his cup in his hands. "The Dobbins boy, the oldest one, Henry, he stopped me before the hearing started. Outside the building. He looked like he'd been awake all night." Elizabeth looked at him. He said, "Mr. Hayes, my daddy farmed that land for 9 years. He never once asked for anything in writing, because he said your father was a man of his word." Nathaniel paused. Then he said, "Are you?" The room was very quiet except for the rain. "What did you say?" "I said yes." He set the cup down. And then I went inside and made sure it was true. Elizabeth looked at him across the table, this man who had spent 6 weeks mending fences and reading her letters and deciding, slowly, whether to trust the situation enough to act it in it. She thought about all the things she had not known when she was directing him to repair the drainage line. She thought about all the things she had been exactly right about anyway. Without knowing why. Your wife, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. He stilled. I'm sorry, she said. I don't have to know. He looked at the table. It's you can ask. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited with the patience she had learned over years of working with people, the patience that understood some things could not be rushed. Her name was Catherine. She died 2 years ago, fever. In January. Fast, the whole thing was faster than anyone had time to understand. He paused. We had been married 6 years. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said. And she meant it, not the reflexive courtesy of it, but the actual thing. After she died, he said, I managed the estate from Lexington. Badly. I signed what Pruitt sent me. I read the summaries and accepted them because they were plausible, and I didn't have the will to look closely. He turned the cup again. I told myself it was grief, it was partly, but it was also easier to look away. It's easier until it isn't, Elizabeth said. Yes, he looked up. The Tunstall's, 17 years. That's on me. That I let 17 years of a family's presence on this land go without documentation. He said it directly. Without self-pity, the honest account of a man who had decided to see his own choices clearly. I won't let that be what I'm known for. You're not, she said. You're the man who came back. He looked at her. She had not meant it to land the way it clearly did, like a thing he had needed to hear. From someone whose opinion he had come to regard as reliable. She watched him receive it, this quiet man who had been lonely in a very specific way. The kind of loneliness that came from people only ever seeing one part of you. And she understood that she had just given him something real. She understood also that he was not the only one it had moved. She picked up her cup. I should organize the hearing documents tonight, she said. While everything is still clear, it can wait until morning. I sleep better when things are organized. He almost smiled. I know, he said. I've read your reports. She gave him a look that was not entirely without humor. Then she took her coffee and went to the study. She was at the desk when Caleb knocked on the study door at 8:30. He was holding a folded note with the expression of a boy trying not to appear as curious as he was. Someone brought this to the kitchen door, he said. A man on a horse. He wouldn't give his name. Elizabeth took the note. Unfolded it. It was short. Written in a hand she didn't recognize. Cramp. Hurried, the writing of someone going fast. Miss Carter, you have made a powerful enemy today. Whitmore does not accept losses. Watch what you sign and who you trust. Not everyone in that room today was there to see justice done. A friend. She read it twice. Then she put it in the leather case with everything else and went to find Nathaniel. He was in the parlor, not reading. The book was open, but he was staring past it at the wall with the expression of a man thinking through something difficult. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the note without speaking. He read it, his jaw tightened. A friend, he said. I don't know who sent it. Whitmore was in that room. He looked at the note. He saw everything. He heard the finding. He looked up. He's not a man who accepts that kind of public outcome without a response. What kind of response? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He's a landman. His power comes from acquisition, from accumulating property and leverage. What he lost today was not just this particular transaction. He lost position. In a room full of people from this county who now know he was attempting to acquire land through a corrupted agent, he set the note down. Men like Whitmore respond to that by finding another angle. What angle does he have left? Nathaniel looked at her steadily. The hearing established that Pruitt acted without authority. It did not fully resolve the question of the eastern acreage. The tenant agreements aren't signed yet. The independent accounting review hasn't begun. He paused. There are still open spaces in the legal situation. A man with money and motivation can find ways to work in open spaces. Elizabeth thought about the Dobbinses, the Hargraves, the widow Macready, the Tunstalls, their agreements not yet signed. Still verbal, still vulnerable. We need to move faster, she said. I know. Cord needs to have those agreements drafted and signed before the end of this week. Not next. I'll ride to him in the morning, tonight, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression she used when she had assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion and was not interested in negotiating its basic terms. He picked up his coat. Tonight, he agreed. He came back after midnight. In the rain that had never quite stopped, with Cord's promise that the agreements would be completed in draft by Thursday and ready for signatures Friday morning. Elizabeth knew this because she was still at the desk when he came in. And he stopped in the study doorway and told her, and she made a note of it. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she replied. I will. He didn't move from the doorway. He looked at her, at the organized paper, the neat ledger columns, the lamp still burning over it all, with an expression she could not fully read but that had something in it that was too specific to be generosity and too warm to be only respect. Miss Carter, he said. Elizabeth, she corrected. The way he had used her name once in the study after Pruitt left. Something shifted in his face. Elizabeth. He said it once. Carefully, like he was establishing something. When this is settled, the accounts, the tenancy agreements, the review, I want to talk to you about the position. She looked at him. My position, the scope of it. He paused. Pruitt managed the accounts from town. At a distance. Corruptly. What this estate needs is someone managing the full relationship between the land and the people on it. The accounts, the household, the tenant arrangements. Someone present and reliable and... He stopped. I'm not describing it well. You're describing an estate manager, she said. I'm describing you, he said. What you've been doing for 2 months. Except with the actual authority and the actual information, and a title that reflects it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're offering me a promotion, she said. I'm asking you to stay, he said. In whatever form makes that possible. The rain moved on the roof. The lamp moved in a draft. Elizabeth Carter sat at her desk in this man's house that she had been managing for 2 months, with inadequate authority and inadequate information, and she understood clearly that he was asking her something that had at least 2 answers, depending on how you listened. Let's settle the accounts and sign the agreements first, she said. Then we'll talk about the position. He nodded. All right. He went to bed. She stayed at the desk for another hour, not because she needed to, but because she needed the familiar steadiness of work to organize the things moving through her that were less familiar and considerably harder to file neatly. The twist came on Thursday, and it came from a direction none of them had anticipated. Cord arrived in the morning with the drafted agreements. As promised. He also arrived with a letter that he placed on the kitchen table in front of Nathaniel, with the expression of a man delivering something he would prefer not to. It was from a court in Lexington. Elizabeth read it over Nathaniel's shoulder. It was a formal legal challenge, not from Whitmore. Not from Pruitt, but from a woman named Dorothea Hayes, listed in the document as the sister of Nathaniel's late father, and her lawyer. The challenge asserted that the Hayes estate, upon the death of Nathaniel's father 5 years prior, had passed to Nathaniel under a will that was now being contested on the grounds that a more recent will existed, one that divided the estate between Nathaniel and 3 named relatives, including Dorothea, and that significant decisions about the estate's land, including any formalization of tenant agreements, required the consent of all parties with potential interest. Nathaniel read it once. Then he set it down very flat on the table. Dorothea, he said. You know her, Cord said. She contested the will when my father died, Nathaniel said. The court found in my favor. She accepted the finding. He looked at Cord. Or I believe she had. She accepted it publicly, Cord said. Privately, she appears to have retained a lawyer and continued to build a case. He paused. The challenge cites the Whitmore situation as evidence that the estate is being mismanaged in ways that disadvantaged the other potential heirs. Elizabeth spoke before she could stop herself. She's using the hearing. Both men looked at her. The hearing was public record, she said. Everything Cord submitted, the accounting discrepancies. The management problems, it's all on record now. She's taking Nathaniel's own evidence of Pruitt's mismanagement and using it to argue that the estate has been poorly overseen. She looked at Cord. She couldn't challenge the will on its own merits. So she's challenging it on the grounds that the estate's condition demonstrates the heir's incapacity. Cord looked at her for a moment. That is an accurate reading, he said. It's also, she said, completely dishonest. It's also, Cord said, a legal strategy that will work if we don't move quickly. He looked at Nathaniel. The challenge doesn't automatically freeze anything. But if she files in Lexington court and gets a sympathetic ear, a judge could issue a temporary injunction on major estate decisions while the challenge is heard, including the tenant agreements, Nathaniel said. Including the tenant agreements. Silence. Elizabeth thought about the Tunstall boy. Henry Dobbins outside the courthouse in the rain. She thought about what Nathaniel had said at supper. Are you a man of your word? And the weight with which he had answered it. How long before she can file? She asked Cord. The challenge is already drafted. She could file as early as next week. Then we sign the agreements today, Elizabeth said. Not Friday, today. Both men looked at her. The challenge questions Nathaniel's authority to make major estate decisions, she said. Formalizing existing tenant arrangements that have been in practice for years. In some cases, decades, is not a major decision. It is a documentation of existing conditions. It is considerably harder to challenge an arrangement that already existed than to prevent one from being created. She looked at Cord. Is that legally sound? Cord was quiet for 3 seconds. It's defensible, he said. Can we do it today? Cord looked at Nathaniel. I have the drafted agreements in my case. They need to be witnessed and signed. If Mr. Hayes is willing, get the families here, Nathaniel said to Elizabeth. She was already standing. I'll take the wagon. Elizabeth, his voice stopped her at the doorway. She turned. Take Caleb with you, he said. I want someone with you on the road. She looked at him. She had not, until that moment, considered that there might be a reason to be cautious about her own movements. That the note through the kitchen door had been a warning about a specific kind of danger rather than a general one. The consideration moved through her quickly. All right, she said. She took Caleb and the wagon and went first to the Dobbins farm. Henry Dobbins answered the door himself, his father beside him, an older man. Weathered, with the careful eyes of someone who had been waiting a long time for things to go either well or badly and had stopped predicting which. Elizabeth explained in plain, direct terms what was happening. The agreements were ready. They needed to be signed today. There was a legal challenge developing that made speed necessary. The elder Dobbins looked at her for a long moment. Is Mr. Hayes behind this? He asked. He's waiting at the house with the lawyer, she said. And you? He looked at her with the frank, evaluating look of a man who had dealt with a lot of people speaking for other people. Who are you to him? It was a fair question. It was also a question she did not have a perfectly organized answer to. I'm the person who's been making sure this estate is managed in the interest of the people on it, she said. Including your family. The elder Dobbins looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. Give us 10 minutes to get our coats, he said. All 4 families came. It took most of the afternoon, the travel. The gathering, the explanations, the careful reading of each agreement by each family head. The questions that Cord answered with the precision of a man who understood what was really being asked. Not just what does this paper say, but will this actually protect us, and is this real, and what happens if someone challenges it? Cord answered everything. Nathaniel answered the questions that required the human weight of the man who owned the land. And Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table throughout the whole of it. Available and organized, the person who had the specific answer to every specific question about the household. The arrangements, the history of how things had worked, and how they were going to work now. The Dobbins family signed first. Henry's father picked up the pen and looked at it for a moment and then said, very quietly, my wife would have been glad to see this day, and signed his name. The Hargraves signed quickly and completely, the way people signed things they had been waiting a long time for. The widow Macready read every word twice, asked Cord to explain 2 clauses in different language, and then signed with the precise care of a woman who had learned not to trust anything until she understood it fully. The Tunstalls were last. The father signed. Then his oldest son, who had been watching the whole proceeding from the corner of the kitchen with the contained intensity of a young man understanding for the first time what legal protection actually felt like, said, "Can I ask something, Mr. Hayes?" "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Why didn't this happen before?" The room went quiet in the specific way of a room containing a hard truth that everyone already knew. Nathaniel looked at the young man directly. "Because I failed to see what needed doing," he said. "And by the time I did, someone else had to show me the urgency." He glanced at Elizabeth briefly. "I'm sorry it took this long." The young Tunstall looked at him. Looked at Elizabeth. Looked at the signed agreement in front of him. "All right," he said. "Thank you." After the families left, the kitchen was quiet. Cord organized the signed copies, one for each family. One for the estate record, one for his own files, with the satisfied efficiency of a man who had done exactly what he came to do. "I'll file the estate copies with Holloway's office tomorrow," he said. "That puts them in public record before Dorothea can file in Lexington." "Will that be enough?" Nathaniel asked. "To protect the agreements, yes. To resolve the will challenge." Cord looked at him. "That's a longer road. She has standing to file. The challenge will have to be heard." He paused. "But we're in considerably better position than we were this morning." He left. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the late afternoon was moving into evening. And Caleb was in the barn, and Martha had gone home. And the house had settled into the particular stillness of a long day finally ending. Nathaniel stood at the kitchen window with his back to her. "Dorothea," he said. Not like a curse, more like a weight he was picking up and examining. "She wasn't close to my father. She wasn't close to any of us. Really. But she has 3 children, and the land has value." And he stopped. "And people find reasons to want what they believe they're owed." "Did she have any real claim in the original will?" Elizabeth asked. "She believed so. The court found against her." He turned. "She may have new evidence. Or she may have a new lawyer. Or she may simply be betting that circumstances have changed enough to make another attempt worthwhile." He looked at Elizabeth. "She'll be in Lexington court within 2 weeks. Then we'll be ready in 2 weeks." He looked at her. "You don't have to be part of this. What I'm asking, what I've already asked, it's far beyond what any housekeeper should be expected to carry." She met his eyes. "You told me 2 days ago you were asking me to stay in whatever form makes that possible," she said. "I said we'd talk about it after the accounts and the agreements." She paused. "The agreements are signed. The accounts are in review. I'm talking about it now." He was very still. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because of employment and not because of duty. Because what's happening on this land matters, and I am useful to it." She stopped, recalibrated, started again on ground that was more honest. "I'm saying that I've been in positions where I was asked to look away from what mattered, and I left those positions. And I am in a position now where everything that matters is directly in front of me, and I am being given the means to do something about it." She held his gaze. "That's not something I'm willing to walk away from." He looked at her for a long time. "The will challenge," he said carefully. "If Dorothea is successful in the worst case, the estate's decisions over the last months could be examined. Your actions, your testimony at the hearing, your role in all of this." He was saying it clearly, making sure she understood. "You would be part of the legal record. Potentially a contested part. I know. It could affect your professional reputation. Your ability to find work elsewhere if Nathaniel. She said his name the way he had said hers once. Establishing something. I lost my last position defending a girl who couldn't defend herself. I would do it again. I would do this again. That is either a recommendation or a warning. And I'll leave it to you to decide which. Something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the almost smile, not the real laugh, not the controlled authority. Something quieter and more specific than any of those. Something that looked like relief, the particular relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy, alone, for a very long time and has just finally been offered another set of hands. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped when he was close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she had chosen to. Which she had not chosen to, because she was Elizabeth Carter, and she did not do things without choosing them. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to hear it as itself. Not as a complication of everything else that's happening. She waited. When you arrived here 8 weeks ago, he said, and you asked me if I was the farmhand. And I told you I'd take care of this land. That was the most honest thing I had said to anyone in 2 years. Not because it was the complete truth, but because it was the part that mattered. He held her gaze. I take care of this land. Not a name. Not an estate, not the heir of anything. The man who is responsible for this ground and the people on it. He paused. You saw that person. You worked alongside that person. You trusted that person enough to stand in a courtroom and defend his interests in front of a magistrate and a room full of strangers. Another pause. And that is something I don't have words that are adequate to. Elizabeth breathed very carefully. You had better find some, she said, because inadequate words are my professional problem. Not yours. He looked at her with those steady, open eyes. I would like you to stay, he said, not as housekeeper. Not as estate manager. As he started again. I am asking you, Elizabeth, to consider a few venture on this land. That is, he stopped again. That is what, she said. That is whatever you want it to be, he said. On your terms. In whatever form makes sense to you. I'm not asking for anything except a pause that had real weight in it. Except the chance to keep being seen by someone who sees the actual thing. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the last of the light was going. Elizabeth Carter looked at this man who had carried her trunk on the first day and fixed her roof and stood beside her in a courtroom and ridden through rain to a lawyer's office because she had said tonight and he had agreed, and she felt the full complicated architecture of the past 8 weeks rearrange itself into something she could finally see clearly. It was not simple. None of it was simple. There was a will challenge and an independent accounting review, and Whitmore somewhere in the background nursing a loss, and Dorothea Hayes with a lawyer in Lexington, and all the ordinary complicated work of a property that needed constant, honest attention. But underneath all of that, holding all of it, was this. This man. This work that mattered. I'll stay, she said. Something moved through him like weather breaking. On your terms, he said immediately. Whatever those are. I'll tell you what they are, she said. When I've decided what they are. Which may take some time. I have time, he said. You have a will challenge in 2 weeks. After the will challenge, he said. And the corner of his mouth moved in that way she had never fully learned to predict. I have all the time there is. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned back to the kitchen table, sat down, and picked up her pen. We have documents to organize before morning, she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And they worked, side by side in the lamplight, while the Kentucky summer dark settled all around them. Steady and warm and full of what was coming. The Lexington court set the hearing date for a Tuesday. 12 days after Dorothea Hayes filed her challenge. 12 days was not long. Elizabeth knew it. Cord knew it. Nathaniel knew it with the particular clarity of a man who had spent the better part of 2 months watching deadlines approach and to time meet them or be buried by them. What was different now was that none of them were meeting it alone. The work started the morning after the tenant agreements were signed and did not stop. Cord came to the estate 3 times in those 12 days, each visit longer than the last. He brought depositions, legal precedents, the estate's property records going back 20 years. He spread everything across the study desk, and he and Nathaniel went through it with the thoroughness of men who understood that the oppositions had been building this case quietly for years, and they had less than 2 weeks to answer it. Elizabeth organized everything they produced. That was how she would have described it. If someone had asked, she organized. But what she actually did was considerably more than that. She cross-referenced Cord's legal citations against the estate documents she had spent 2 months learning inside and out. She found, on the 9th day, a discrepancy in the dates that Dorothea's challenge used to establish the timeline of the original, while filing a discrepancy of 11 days that Cord, when she showed it to him, went very quiet over for a full minute before saying, "Miss Carter, where did you find this?" "The estate's correspondence file," she said. "There's a letter from the original solicitor dated 11 days before the date Dorothea's challenge cites as the will's formal submission. If the will was submitted on the date she claims, this letter predates it. But the letter references the will as already filed." Cord picked up the letter. "Read it. Set it down. This puts her timeline off by almost 2 weeks. It puts her lawyer's argument off," Elizabeth corrected. "It doesn't change the will itself." "No," Cord said. "But if the timeline she used to establish the grounds for challenging the will is demonstrably inaccurate, it raises serious questions about the quality of the evidence underlying the challenge as a whole." He looked at her. "This is significant." Nathaniel was in the doorway. He had come in quietly. While they were talking, she was used to that. The way he moved in this house now, the comfortable presence of a man no longer pretending to be anything other than exactly where he belonged. "How significant?" he asked Cord. "Potentially determinative," Cord said. He picked up the letter again. "If the judge sees this, and I will make certain the judge sees this, it doesn't just weaken her case. It calls into question the foundational premise of why the challenge was filed now." At this moment, after years of apparent acceptance of the original finding, Elizabeth looked at the letter in Cord's hands. She thought about the morning. She had opened every drawer in the study, walked every room, made her lists. She had been a housekeeper doing a housekeeper's work. She had filed that letter in the correspondence folder because that was where correspondence belonged. She had not known then what it would mean. "Is it enough?" Nathaniel asked Cord directly. "Combined with everything else we have?" Cord looked at him steadily. "Yes, I believe it is." The night before the Lexington hearing, Elizabeth could not sleep. She lay in the housekeeper's room, her room. She had started thinking of it that way, without noticing the moment she had started, and she listened to the house settle around her, and she thought about all the things that could still go wrong. Dorothea Hayes's lawyer was experienced. The challenge had been carefully constructed. The judge in Lexington was known to be fair, which was not the same as known to be predictable. Whitmore was somewhere in the background, and the anonymous note through the kitchen door had never been explained. And she still did not know whose hand had written it, or whether the warning it carried had been fully accounted for. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to the study and went over everything one more time. Nathaniel found her there at 5:30. He stood in the doorway in the gray pre-dawn and looked at her at the organized papers. The lamp, the woman who had been awake since before the birds and said nothing for a moment. "You're ready," he said finally. "I want to be certain. You found the date discrepancy," he said. "You've organized 4 months of estate documents. You wrote a testimony that Cord said was the clearest account of events he has ever received from a non-legal witness." He crossed to the desk, picked up the stack of organized papers, and set them down again. "Elizabeth, you're ready." She looked up at him. "What if the judge doesn't? We appeal." He said it calmly, with the certainty of a man who had decided what he was fighting for and was not going to stop fighting for it. because the first attempt failed. And then we appeal again. And we keep the tenant agreements in public record, and we protect the land, and we keep going. He paused. But I don't think that's what's going to happen today. She looked at him for a moment. You're remarkably calm. I'm not calm, he said quietly. I'm decided. Those are different things. She understood that distinction. She had lived inside it herself for most of her adult life. She closed the leather case. All right, she said. Let's go. The Lexington courthouse was 3 hours by carriage, and they were on the road before sunrise, and Cord met them on the steps when they arrived with the focused expression of a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment and was ready to perform it well. The courtroom was larger than the hearing room in Harlan. More formal wood paneling, high ceilings, the weight of institutional authority in every surface. Elizabeth sat beside Cord at the table designated for the respondent's party and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the room the way she had learned to look at every new room, clearly, without flinching, finding the structure of it. Dorothea Hayes was across the aisle. Elizabeth had not seen her before she was a woman in her late 60s. Well-dressed in the way of someone who cared about being perceived as dignified. With a lawyer beside her who was everything Cord had described. Broad, self-satisfied, expensive. He arranged his papers with the confidence of a man who had never seriously entertained the possibility of losing. He should have entertained it. He opened the challenge with the argument Cord had anticipated the estate's documented management problems. The hearing record, the accounting discrepancies, the evidence of neglect that he framed as proof of an heir unfit to manage the property responsibly. He was skilled and persuasive, and Elizabeth watched the judge's face as he spoke and could not read it, which made her careful. Then Cord stood up. He did not start with the date discrepancy. He started with the tenancy agreements. He submitted them to the judge, signed, witnessed, filed in public record, and he established clearly and methodically that the estate's management problems had been identified, addressed, and corrected by the current owner within a defined period, with specific and documented results. He submitted Holloway's hearing finding. He submitted the Independent Accounting Review's preliminary report, which had arrived 2 days earlier and confirmed that while discrepancies existed in Pruitt's records, the estate itself was financially sound and its land value was intact. He built the picture carefully, the way good lawyers built things. Foundation first, then walls, then roof, and then he placed the letter on the judge's desk. He explained the date discrepancy in 3 sentences. He let the document speak for itself, he said very quietly. The challenge's foundational timeline is demonstrably inaccurate by 11 days. The evidence establishing that inaccuracy was found in the estate's own correspondence files, organized by the estate's current household manager, Miss Elizabeth Carter. The judge looked at the letter. He looked at the date. He looked at Dorothea's lawyer. The lawyer said something that Elizabeth could not hear, leaning toward the judge, speaking in low, urgent tones. The judge listened, looked at the letter again, set it down. He asked Dorothea's lawyer a question, directly, in a voice Elizabeth could hear clearly. Are you aware of this correspondence prior to filing the challenge timeline? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. That silence was its own answer. The judge looked at his papers. He did not look particularly surprised. He looked like a man arriving at a conclusion he had been approaching for the past 2 hours, and finding that the conclusion was where he had expected it to be. Dorothea Hayes was watching from her seat across the aisle. Elizabeth looked at her not with hostility, not with triumph, but with the honest attention she brought to everything. This was a woman who had believed, perhaps genuinely, that she had been denied something she was owed. That belief had been weaponized by a lawyer and by proximity to Whitmore's interests into something that had threatened 4 families and an estate and the man responsible for both. Elizabeth did not hate her for it. She understood it. That did not mean she had been willing to let it win. The judge delivered his finding in the careful, measured language of a man building a record that would stand. The challenge's evidentiary basis was insufficient. The timeline irregularity raised serious questions about the accuracy of the documents submitted in support. The original will finding stood. The estate remained under Nathaniel Hayes's sole ownership and management authority. The challenge was dismissed. Dorothea did not look at Nathaniel when it was over. She spoke quietly to her lawyer and then walked out of the courtroom with the careful composure of a woman maintaining her dignity in a loss. And Elizabeth watched her go and felt nothing except the slow, exhaling relief of something finished. Nathaniel was beside her. She was aware of him the way she had been aware of him in every room for the past 3 months specifically, constantly, as a presence that had become as familiar as the sound of the house at night. "It's done," Cord said, closing his case. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "We ride back to Harlan." Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "We ride back to Harlan." 3 weeks after the Lexington hearing. On a morning in late September, when the Kentucky heat had finally broken and the air had the first cool edge of autumn in it, Elizabeth Carter sat at the desk in what was now formally called the estate manager's office, a room adjacent to the study that had previously been used for storage and had been cleared, cleaned, and furnished at Nathaniel's suggestion and Elizabeth's direction, and wrote the first monthly report under her new title. It was a good report. The independent accounting review had concluded. Pruitt's discrepancies had been fully documented, 3 years of minor diversions that added up to a sum that made Cord's expression tighten when he saw it. And that was now the subject of a separate civil proceeding that would occupy a different courtroom in a different county for the next several months. The estate's actual financial position, once the accurate numbers were established, was considerably stronger than Pruitt's summaries had suggested. The land was sound. The crops on the tenant sections were in good shape. The household was running the way a household ran when it was properly staffed and properly managed. Caleb had been moved inside. He had his own room now, off the back hall, and he took his meals with the household. And he had recently informed Elizabeth that he intended to learn to read properly so that he could eventually be of use with the correspondence. She had arranged for him to spend an hour each morning with the Bible and whatever other text she could put in front of him. And he was making serious progress. Martha had received a wage increase that Elizabeth had put in the first budget she submitted to Nathaniel. Nathaniel had approved it without comment, which was exactly how it should have been handled. The Dobbins family had planted a winter crop on their section. The Hargraves had repaired the roof of their barn using materials Elizabeth had sourced, and Nathaniel had arranged to be delivered. The widow McCready had stopped by the estate on a Wednesday with a jar of preserved peaches for Martha, and had stood in the kitchen for 20 minutes talking to Elizabeth with the particular ease of a woman who had decided to trust and was glad she had. The Tunstall boy, the one who had asked Nathaniel in the kitchen whether he was a man of his word, had come by on a Saturday with his father to ask about the possibility of the estate purchasing the surplus from fall harvest. That's rather than the family needing to transport it to market in Harlan. Nathaniel had said yes on the spot, and Elizabeth had spent the following hour working out a fair price and a collection arrangement, which was the kind of problem she was very good at, and which she would not have been able to solve 3 months ago because she had not had the authority or the information to solve it. She had both now. She was writing that into the report, clearly and specifically, when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "Cord is coming Thursday," he said. "I know. I have the accounting review summary organized for him." She didn't look up from her writing. "And the preliminary documentation for the Pruitt civil proceeding. He's bringing someone else." She looked up. "A woman from Louisville," Nathaniel said. "A teacher. Her name is Ada Marsh. She runs a small school for working-class children in Louisville, and she's been trying to expand for 2 years." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her face. I've been corresponding with her since August. I think there's land on the eastern section, not the portion the Dobbinses and Tunstall's are farming. The unused portion beyond the creek that could support a schoolhouse. Elizabeth set her pen down. She looked at him. A school, she said, on Hayes land. For the children on this property and in the surrounding area. The tenant family's children. The families in the nearest two settlements, there are at least 30 children within reasonable distance who have no access to formal education. He held her gaze. Ada Marsh knows how to run a school. I can provide the land and the building materials. What I need is someone to manage the logistics of establishing it. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. You've been planning this since August, she said. Since before you arrived, he said. Catherine wanted it. She talked about it the last year before she died, a school on this land. Something that used the estate's position for something permanent. He paused. I stopped thinking about it after she was gone. I started thinking about it again. Around told me you had lost your position for defending someone who couldn't defend herself. She absorbed that. You're asking me to manage the school's establishment, she said. I'm asking you to be involved in it, however makes sense to you, he said. You organize everything better than anyone I have ever met. You understand what people need before they know to ask for it. And you stopped. Started again more honestly. You care about the right things. That's what a school needs. At the beginning, someone who cares about the right things. Elizabeth looked at the window. She thought about 30 children. She thought about Caleb sounding out words at the kitchen table every morning, with his forehead furrowed in concentration. She thought about the widow Macready, who had told her in that kitchen conversation that her youngest had never been inside a schoolroom. She thought about what she had told Nathaniel, weeks ago, on the day she said she was staying, that what she was afraid of was the wrong thing winning. A school was not the wrong thing winning. A school was the right thing. Built on solid ground, with the intention of outlasting everyone who built it. Tell Ada Marsh I'll meet her Thursday, Elizabeth said. And have Cord bring the eastern section land surveys when he comes. Nathaniel looked at her with that expression, the open one. The unguarded one, the one she had seen for the first time in the yard after Whitmore left, and had been seeing with increasing frequency ever since. Yes, ma'am, he said. She gave him the look that expression deserved. He smiled, the real one, the full one, the one she had only heard once before in its complete form, and went back to his work. Ada Marsh arrived on Thursday with Cord and turned out to be a small, direct woman in her early 40s with the immediately recognizable quality of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had long since stopped being interested in correcting the misapprehension. She shook Elizabeth's hand with the grip of a person who meant it, and looked at her with frank, evaluating attention. Mr. Cord tells me you organized the documentation that broke the will challenge, she said. I found a letter in the correspondence file, Elizabeth said. He says you also documented the tenant family arrangements, managed a consortium refusal, and testified at a county magistrate's hearing. Ada looked at her steadily. All as housekeeper. All as estate manager, Nathaniel said from behind Elizabeth. And she heard the mild, precise correction in his voice, and chose not to look back at him, because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her expression. Ada Marsh did look at Nathaniel. Then she looked back at Elizabeth with the recalibrated assessment of a woman who had just received additional information and was incorporating it efficiently. I'd like to see the eastern section land, she said. And then I want to talk about what a school needs, and what you're prepared to provide, and what the realistic timeline looks like. I have the land surveys, Elizabeth said. And I've drafted a preliminary list of what an initial schoolhouse would require in terms of materials and labor, based on what the estate can source locally. Ada looked at the folder Elizabeth was holding. You drafted it before we met. I like to be prepared. Something shifted in Ada's expression, not a smile exactly. But the thing before a smile, the recognition of a kindred quality. Show me the surveys, she said. They walked the eastern section that afternoon. All four of them, Nathaniel, Elizabeth Court, and Ada, with the land surveys in hand and the first cool autumn light on everything. Ada asked specific questions about distance from the nearest settlements, water access, building materials, and seasonal road conditions. Elizabeth answered most of them, from the surveys, and from 3 months of learning this land on foot. Ada stopped at a particular point on the eastern a level area beyond the creek with old oaks at the perimeter and open ground in the center, and stood very still for a moment. "Here," she said. Nathaniel looked at the spot, then at Elizabeth. "It's good ground," Elizabeth confirmed, "well drained. The oaks would give shade in summer. The road from the 2 nearest settlements passes within a quarter mile. I can have 30 children," Ada said. "Possibly more by spring if word travels. I'll need a building. I'll need a stove. I'll need basic slates and primers. I can source those from Louisville. I'll need someone in the county who will support the school's existence when people push back." She looked at Nathaniel. "And they will push back. Not everyone in this county is going to welcome a school for working-class children on a private estate. Let them push," Nathaniel said. Ada looked at him for a moment. "You understand what you're doing." "I understand what this land is for," he said. Ada looked at Elizabeth. "And you? What's your role in this once it's built?" Elizabeth looked at the open ground. She thought about all the answers available to her. Estate manager, organizer, administrator, the person who runs the practical operation while others run the meaningful one. All of those were true. None of them were the full answer. "I grew up in a county where the children who didn't have fathers with money didn't get schooling," she said. "I had a mother who taught me to read and cipher at the kitchen table because she understood that no one else was going to do it." She paused. "I spent 4 years managing other people's households. I'm going to spend the next part of my life making sure other people's children don't have to rely on kitchen tables." Ada Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "When can we break ground?" The first stone of the schoolhouse was laid in October, on a morning with just enough chill to make the work feel clean. Nathaniel swung the first sledgehammer. It was not ceremonial. The foundation stones needed actual breaking. And he was the strongest person present, and he did it the way he did everything. Without announcement or performance. Caleb worked beside him, which was Caleb's insistence, and no one had argued with it. Henry Dobbins brought his father and 2 brothers. The Tunstall family arrived at 8 in the morning with tools and a cart of timber they had cut from their own section, which Nathaniel had not asked for and which Henry explained, when asked, by saying only, "You kept your word, Mr. Hayes. We keep ours." Elizabeth documented the day's progress in a new ledger. Building materials received. Labor contributed, work completed. It was what she did. It was what she was good at. But she set the ledger down in the early afternoon and stood in the open ground and watched the foundation taking shape under the hands of men who had every reason to believe that the people with power in this county were not interested in their welfare. And she felt something. She did not have a precise word for not happiness exactly, though that was part of it. Something more structural than happiness. Something that felt like standing on ground that was finally solid after a long time of uncertain footing. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. They stood for a moment without speaking, watching the work. "Catherine would have liked this," he said. "Quiet. Honest. Tell me about her," Elizabeth said. He was still for a beat. "Then she was stubborn," he said. "In the good way. The way where you could see exactly what she thought, even when she was being perfectly polite about it." He paused. "She would have argued with you about the curriculum." "I would have won," Elizabeth said. "Yes," he said, and his voice held both grief and something warmer than grief. The way only real things could hold 2 true feelings at once. "You would have." She looked at him. He was looking at her. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "I told you I would." "You did." He turned to face her fully, the way he did when he was about to say something he had decided to say completely. "Elizabeth, What I asked you weeks ago in the kitchen I said on your terms. In whatever form I meant it. But he paused. Started again. I don't want to leave it as an open question indefinitely. That isn't fair to either of us. She looked at him steadily. What are you asking, she said. I'm asking, he said. Whether the terms you've been deciding on have come to any conclusions. The work went on around them, hammers and voices, and the solid sound of stone being placed on stone. The autumn light was clean and specific on everything. Elizabeth thought about the past 4 months. She thought about a woman stepping off a wagon with 3 coins in her glove and 1 letter that said she had a job waiting. She thought about a man mending a fence who told her he took care of this land. She thought about all the things that had been true from the beginning. Before she knew what she was standing inside. I have some conditions, she said. Name them. The school remains independent of the estate's finances. Ada Marsh makes educational decisions without interference from anyone, including you. Agreed. My role as estate manager is a formal position with documented responsibilities and authority. Not a courtesy title. Already done. Court has the paperwork. She looked at him. You had court draft that already. Last week. I was hopeful, he said. Those are different things. She heard her own distinction reflected back at her and felt something give way in her chest, gently. The way ice gave way at the end of winter, not breaking but releasing. One more condition, she said. Yes, you tell me the truth, she said. All of it. Whatever is happening on this land in this house. In any legal office, in any county, you tell me directly. No summaries, no filtering. No letting operate inside a partial picture. She held his gaze. I can handle the truth. I cannot handle being managed. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I have known that since the 2nd week you were here. He paused. I should have told you who I was sooner. I will not make that mistake again. She believed him. Not because she was inclined to trust easily, she wasn't. And years of work in other people's households had not made her more so. She believed him because she had watched this man, up close and without the filter of his title, for 4 months. And she knew the shape of his honesty, the way she knew the layout of his house. It was structural. It was load-bearing. It was not going to give way under pressure because it was not performed, it was simply what he was made of. All right, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically the way he did everything, without announcement. Simply and directly. His hand was the hand of a man who had spent the summer working the land beside her. Calloused and warm, and it held hers with the specific care of someone handling something they were not going to let go of. Is that a yes? He asked. She looked at him. At this man who had carried her trunk and fixed her roof, and stood beside her in a courtroom, and ridden through rain on a Tuesday night because she said tonight, and he said agreed. This man who read her letters and protected his tenants and laid foundation stones without ceremony. This man who had been lonely in the specific way that people were lonely when no one could see the actual thing. She had seen it. She had always seen it. That, Elizabeth Carter said, is a yes. The schoolhouse went up stone by stone through October. And by November it had walls and a roof and a stove that Martha declared adequate after a brief personal inspection. Ada Marsh held the first class on the 1st of December. With 11 children on the first day and 19 by the end of the week. And word moving through the settlements the way good news moved when it was real quietly. Steadily, reaching the people who needed it most. Caleb was in that first class. He sat in the front row and held his slate with both hands and paid attention with the focused intensity of a boy who understood that something was being given to him that was not going to be taken away. Elizabeth watched from the back of the room and did not let her face show what was moving through her. Because she was Elizabeth Carter and she had standards to maintain. But she watched. Nathaniel stood beside her. His hand found hers in the back of that schoolroom. And she let it, and they stood together in the place they had built and watched the first children of this land learn their letters in the winter light. That was how it began, not with a grand declaration or a formal ceremony, but with the ordinary, irreversible fact of a good thing happening in a room full of children who deserved it. And Elizabeth Carter, who had arrived on this land with 3 coins and a letter, and nothing else except her backbone and her word, understood in that moment what she had known, in some form, since the first afternoon she had walked a strange property with a man who told her he took care of this land. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had stayed. She had built something that would last long after the legal proceedings and the accounting reviews and the will challenges were settled and filed and forgotten. She had found the person who could see the actual thing, and she had let herself be seen in return, and that all of that was not something that could be undone by time or distance or the ordinary difficulties of an ordinary life on solid Kentucky ground. Elizabeth Carter had walked into the unknown with nothing but her word. Her word had been enough. It always had been.